So if you can please let me know who that is.
It's John Nader here.
Yeah, John, go for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Time. Again, thank you to our witnesses for joining us. I don't want to speculate, but I think my colleague, Mr. Waugh, might be in the running for the new CRTC chair. I've been hearing that rumor, and I think if it's repeated enough, it's
that or the young gentleman who appeared earlier today. I'm guessing with a little rounding off, he's a candidate.
Mr. Wyatt Sharp would be a great suggestion as well. But I want to start off. Obviously the CRTC is constrained and is directed by a couple of different things. One of them being legislation itself. The second being policy directives from the minister. I want to start by confirming that you have not yet been given a policy directive on C11. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in the previous incarnation of this bill, C10, there was a policy directive that was released, at least a draft version, prior to C10 being passed. Obviously not at Royal Assent, but that was done. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you're given this piece of legislation, we are at this point, from a parliamentarian standpoint, providing you with powers that will be further refined, for lack of a better word, by a directive from the minister. Is that correct?
Certain priorities. I mean, there are obviously parameters. We are an arm's length adjudicative body, and there are limits. But yes, the government of the day has the ability to issue a policy direction to the Commission, as you described.
So one of those issues that may be contained and would like to be contained within that would be the concept of discoverability. Would that be a good assumption?
To be honest, I think it would be presumptuous of me to guess what the minister and the government might issue in terms of a policy direction.
I would back up a step then. So if there is no mention of discoverability within a policy directive, how would you interpret that when you're coming to draft regulations? How would you implement discoverability for an online streamer?
As my colleague, Mr. Hutton, responded to Mr. Champoux before, as we do today, it would obviously apply to a larger group, but it's really about outcomes. What we're focused on are outcomes, and in that case, what we're trying to assure is that Canadians can find Canadian content. And let's be clear, today, the platforms we're talking about are also doing that. Netflix identifies Canadian content, Prime does, Spotify does in the audio area, YouTube does, and compensates artists. So this isn't new. And we would continue to do that, and we would be focused on ensuring that Canadians can find Canadian stories and content.
So there is a possibility then that the CRTC could just step back altogether when it comes to the concept of discoverability and leave it as it is now? If
yes,
the platforms are already...
It's a bit vague, and I can't predict what the Commission would do. But what I would say is what we do is pursue. I've described it as, the alternate version of what are the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. Make sure those Canadian stories are told, that they're distributed, and that they're discoverable. So, yes, we will continue to do that.
So you mentioned about outcomes. Does the CRTC have the ability to regulate outcomes?
We have the ability to identify what are desired outcomes, and then I hope in the future to use as much as possible incentives rather than prescription. If you go back to the Harnessing Change report, it's one of the key elements of that report. We need to be adaptable. We need to recognize that different players have different business models. We need to find an equitable framework, but not an identical one. And we need to try and incentivize behavior that is positive for producers and digital content producers and traditional producers alike.
So I guess my question is, if our outcome, we want to have Canadian content, stories being told by Canadians, available to Canadians, how do you get to that outcome in a meaningful way? How do you, for lack of a better word, force people to have Canadian content available?
Well, my answer, as I said a minute ago, preferably by incentives. So, but as I said, they're doing it, and they have good reason to do so. If you take Netflix as an example, or Crave, it doesn't, whether it's a foreign or Canadian producer, they want people to watch programming. And Canadian programming is popular, they will identify it. And we will persist in asking them to make sure Canadians can find that content. That doesn't make anybody watch it. It makes sure people can find it.
And how much of that
Thank you very much. You have 8 seconds, John. So I think we could finish that round, and I will move on.
in my 8
to
seconds, I'll
the-
say thank you as well for the discussion. I'm sure we can follow up